Morning. Our scripture reading this morning is found in Matthew 28, 19 and 20. I'll give you a moment to find that. Hearing the pages stop. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Amen.
Good morning. How many adventurers do we have here today? 2, 4? Well, this sermon's for you. I had prepared it for your camp out, and it got rained out. And then Pastor Dennis asked me to give it a few weeks ago, and I had some eye surgery that I was dealing with. I couldn't think of a reason for today, so it better hurry. As a matter of fact, if you all would like to sing, we've got plenty of time. No, I launched. It sounds so official. I did a sermon on Stephen Haskell a number of years ago, and I was encouraged by Mary Ann Hadley because I had an interest in history, and so I did that, and one kind of led to the other, and by now I should have maybe 24 sermons on our pioneers. Have 4. But it's important that we understand what our pioneers went through. As a matter of fact, Ellen White wrote to Elder Butler, who I think was the president of the Southern Publishing Company in Tennessee, and she said how important it was for us to keep before the people the history of our church. Because people come into the church, they accept the doctrine, but they don't know all of the things that went on to bring us where we are today. And she wasn't saying that for herself. She was obviously a pioneer. But it was important for the struggles for us to be reminded of the struggles that bring us to where we are today, to have the tools that we have today. They had the scriptures. And they sat and hammered out all of the doctrines from all of the churches and found the ones that were identified with Scripture. Not the customs, not the traditions, not all of the things, the trappings that can creep in over years. So my sermon title today is The Ablest Man. And quite frankly, it refers to one particular man, but it refers to all of us. What does it mean to be able? Webster defines it as having the power or the skill or the means to do something. Another definition is skillful and competent. You see, the Bible is full of accounts of able men. And we would be here all day talking about the accomplishments of those able men. God calls upon able men and some rise to the occasion and some don't. But there's lessons in it for all of us, for we are all able. And when I say men, I mean men and women. It's not a masculine thing. We are all able. Look at the women that have that are all through our church history who have risen to the occasion to enable something to happen. Not all men rose to the occasion. I think I'll give you 3 examples right now of people who rose to the occasion. One faltered, one did not, and one was successful. Hazen Foss was given a vision, and in this vision he was also, he saw the opposition that he was going to be faced by doing this. It was daunting. It was something that he was fearful of. And although he had this and he knew it was of God, he just did what he could to put it behind him. But then at one point in time, he remembered that you grieve away the Holy Spirit. I mean, he was scholarly. He knew his Bible. And he decided that I'm in jeopardy of that. And so he called the church members together, and he was going to recall these visions that he had, but he could not do it. It was too late. And he faltered, but he just could not remember the visions. And he said to himself that he was a lost man. And maybe he was. We don't know. I would like to think that perhaps he had a deathbed talk with the Lord. But I don't know. But he did hear Ellen White relate those same visions sometime later, and then he knew that it's what the Lord had told him. And yet he had given it to someone who was sickly. She said the weakest of the weak. She was sickly. And let's face it, the women are supposed to be the weaker sex. I'm sure that that's what that meant. I mean, I'm not trying to be politically correct, but the weakest of the weak. She was a very sick person and didn't finish her education. And as he stood in the shadows, and I think it was on the porch where he was listening to this, he knew that that commission had been given to Ellen White. She rose to the occasion. But there was another man who were given these visions, and his name was William Foy. And but it didn't, he accepted it, and he did what he could to tell people, but it wasn't going to be widely received because he was a man of color. And he knew the prejudices that existed, and he knew that it may not be as received as what it should be, but he did talk about it. And the congregations that he was able to speak to, he talked to them about it. He was a Baptist, and he was studying to be an Episcopal minister. So he had opportunities to speak. And I'm sure he brought this to their attention. So he did what he could, but the mantle really fell upon Ellen White. But can you imagine what Noah must have felt like whenever he was given the commission of building an ark in the middle of the desert, not even close to the water? It had never rained. But yet, the Lord knew he was an able man, and he accepted the challenge, and he built the ark. King David, King Solomon, they were able men. Joseph was an able man. Jonah was able, but he decided that this was not a challenge that he wanted to accept. So he gets on a boat and tries to run. And then when they find themselves in the middle of a storm and find out he's the reason for the storm, they toss him overboard, and a fish just happens to be coming along big enough to swallow him and takes him back within walking distance to where he was supposed to go in the first place. I'm sure in the belly of that fish he had a chance to reconsider his commitment, his ability. And he still had some issues after that, but he was an able man because the Lord chose him. We think of Moses and the challenges that he had to overcome. The Apostle Paul, all of the disciples, they were all men of ability. The men and women of the Waldenses, as they did what they could to save and hide the Scriptures from the persecution of the Church of Rome. They were all able, and they did what the Lord instructed them to do. Our contemporary times have produced men that were able as well. I can't list them all because of the time, but names came out of my brain, what's left of it. HMS Richards Sr. and Jr., Dick Barron. And here's a man that I saw deliver a sermon at an effort one evening from his bed. They had a hospital bed rolled onto the platform, and he preached from what looked kind of like one of those gurneys. He was dying of cancer, but he was an able man, and he was able to continue on till his last breath. I had the chance to visit with Jeannie when she was a member here, because he was the first evangelist that I was ever exposed to. And when I think of evangelists to this day, he's the first image that pops into my mind. The first pastor, Tom Carter, the first pastor that I remember, Tom Carter, was, I used to think that whenever they broke in a pastor, they sent them to Lufkin, Texas. And if you can make it in Lufkin for 3 years, then you're going to a better place. Fort Worth or anywhere. But I mean, we were a very small, at 4 churches, and Tom would make the rounds. Tom is one of the reasons that at some point in my life I decided that I was going to preach. So I bought this little carrying case, and I bought a black Bible. This was bought in 1959. And I bought Haskell's Bible Handbook. And with these 3 things, you had all the tools that you need. Look at how far we've come on the backs and the strength and the imagination and the will of the Lord, and somebody being able to do everything that we possibly need. And now they've got it in a phone. I've got all of Ellen White's writings, all of Doug Batchelor's stuff, everything you can possibly imagine is right here. I have no excuse. I make them, but here they all are. I wish they wouldn't call me. Anyway, it's all done by able men and all done by able women. Mark Finley, Doug Batchelor, Ron Halverson, Don Schneider, all able men. And we're very fortunate to have Brother Schneider in our congregation. His gentle way, his gentle leadership, and his experience has meant a lot to this church. And Don, I thank you so much. An able man. The dedication of our able men and women have propelled our church to be one of the fastest growing Protestant churches in the world, if not the most. We are second only to the Church of Rome in worldwide outreach in our schools, hospitals, clinics, and universities. They've been at it 1,500 years. Smoke and mirrors. Well, I shouldn't say that. They've been at it 1,500 years. We've been at it about 170. So you see what can be accomplished with able men, what we are able to do. Do you see how we are going at such a rate that the Lord, He has to come soon because we're helping to finish the work. Now, like I say, our founding fathers had a lot of information to have to plow through because they went through all of the church doctrines of all the mainstream churches and picked in what they thought was scriptural, and the things that were not, they discarded. And it all started, not so much, the Advent movement started, not so much our church, which came out of that, but the Miller movement. You know, Miller studied the Bible on a particular subject for about 8 years before he decided that he knew what he was talking about. And he really wasn't planning on talking. But he was a church-going man, and he wanted to find out more about the second coming, so he began this study. And for 8 years, he plowed through the Bible. And finally, he decided, okay, I've got all of this information. What am I going to do with it? Should I share it with people? I guess I should. So here's what I'm going to do. And he went out into a little copse of trees, out behind his farmhouse, a little grove of trees. And he talked to the Lord about it. And he said, Lord, you've given me the opportunity to study the Bible, study the soon coming of Christ, and I'm willing to do it. I will do it. Now, of course, what he was not saying was, I'm 55 years old and I'm a farmer. Now, how many people are going to come to a middle-aged farmer and ask him to speak in their church? I mean, farmers were not that literate. It just so happens that William Miller was, but we're talking about the average farmer in that period of time. They didn't read much. They didn't study the Bible much. They went to church and they went through the motions, and then they went home and did whatever they had to do. So he thought that I've satisfied my obligation. Okay? I've told the Lord I would do it, and I will. But nobody's going to come to hear me or talk to me about speaking. So he goes back into the house, and there's a knock at the door. He goes to the door, and it's his nephew, who has ridden 15 miles on a horse at about probably 2.5 miles an hour to get to his house and invite him to speak at their church the next Sunday. Well, he was a little aggravated, to say the least. But it was no coincidence. The boy had started off 6 hours before he even went into the grove of woods. He had already started writing with the information. It was not a coincidence. It was a divine appointment. And I was giving a Bible study, Revelation seminar, and I mentioned the word coincidence. And Harvey Byram said, there's no such thing as a coincidence in this kind of the Lord's work. It's divine appointment. And Harvey, you're absolutely right. I have avoided using the word coincidence ever since then. It was a divine appointment that Miller had, because the Lord already had plans for him, because he knew he was what? An able man. So he went to the church, and he had so much reception that people were starting to join the church. And by the time he got through with that, there were letters that had been mailed earlier that were coming in. He became a speaker, and the people in the area thought, the pastors in the area said, if you want to get good response and get more converts into your church, you need to get William Miller out here to speak, because he can bring them in. That was the result of an able man. And he went on, and the Miller movement was splintered October the 22nd of 1844, when they were all expecting the imminent return of Jesus. Let's move to Joseph Bates. He was an honest and able man. He became enthralled with the Miller message because he had already been a sea captain for years and years, had sold their boat, sold their farm, and were going to invest all of their money into something worthwhile. So he was supporting various temperance movements. But he'd heard about this guy Miller, so he goes to Boston to hear him, and he gets so caught up with what Miller has to say about the second coming that he decided that he's going to join that group, and he did. And he began to speak and go to camp meetings, and he became an eminent speaker in the Miller movement. And it was at a camp meeting that he was introduced to a man by the name of V.V. Snow, who had pinpointed the October 22nd arrival date. It was through his studies. And they announced it to the congregation, and they were so electrified by it that they thought, this is it. And so everybody just kind of caught fire. Now they had a date. They had pinpointed what they needed to prepare for and the time. So they began to sell their farms and not bring in their harvest. They began to do a lot of things in preparation for what was going to happen October the 22nd. But we all know what didn't happen. Now we found out the next day what it meant. It was the right time but the wrong event. So the group splintered and went, there's about 5 different separations. But there was one group that stayed and studied to see what that meant. Joshua Himes, Miller, he only lived about another 5 years. He went and built a church, a little chapel on his property so that people who felt like they couldn't go back to their congregation and face the ridicule, they had a place to come and worship. Joshua Himes said, the bitterness and the disappointment could not be explained unless you were there yourself to go through what we went through. I think he was the one that had the cornfield vision that showed Christ entering the most holy place. But Joseph Bates went on to spread the gospel. He was going to take it west, and he began to speak in lots of places, but he wanted to go west, so he went to Michigan. Now, I don't really see Michigan as being west, but I guess if you're a New Englander, it is west. And he got as far as Berrien Springs. And he got off the train and asked who one of the smartest men was in town, and they told him the postmaster, so he went to the postmaster and he wanted to give him Bible studies. And in those days, things like that were accepted. I mean, you talked about the Lord, you talked about the Bible in those days. Now, if you talk about it, it's almost like you're a nut job. You know, hey, I don't have time for that. We have too many other things to deal with. But in those days, when there was a meeting in town, everybody turned out because it was new. It was different. I mean, they wanted to hear what was going on. Well, look at Berrien Springs today. Look at what was the legacy of him going there. Look at what is in Berrien Springs today. It's a hub of the Advent message and movement. He also went south. He wanted to go south with the message, so he went to Maryland. That's not very south. And years before, he and his dad happened to run aground at a little pile of rocks called Kent Island, which is right in the middle, the northern part of the Chesapeake Bay. I've been over it 500 times if I've been over it once, because I worked that area back and forth on each side of the Chesapeake, and I lived on the eastern shore. So I was on Kent Island a lot. If I knew then what I knew now, I would go find that rocky shore where their boat came aground. But maybe someday I will. They took refuge in a tavern and were able to eventually put everything back together and go on. Now, whenever Bates comes back, he goes and he finds that tavern, and it's the same owner that was there years and years earlier. And he remembers Bates, and he says, well, you can preach right here in my tavern. So Bates began to hold his series of meetings in a beer joint on Kent Island until they could find a place in town. There's not much of a town on Kent Island, but I mean, at one time there was a collection of buildings. And so he preached in the tavern for about 10 days until they got something going. He had a man with him called the Singing Blacksmith, and he would have to be the music, for that. And they traveled all over together. And the singing, and his name escapes me right now, but he comes up later in Bates' life through a series of not coincidences, but divine appointments. And divine appointments enable you. And especially when you can relate those to somebody else, because the Lord puts people in your path all the time, every day. And if you pray about it, you better watch out and be prepared, because it will happen. And you will have the opportunity to witness, to help, to console, to identify with someone who needs that. Just ask the Lord to put the words in your mouth. Just ask the Lord to be with you, and He will enable you, which makes us one of the ablest, because we are willing. Stephen Haskell, he lived to be 90 years old, and the year before he died, he wrote this little book, Haskell's Bible Handbook. And when I was doing this sermon back a few years ago, there was about 8 churches in the conference. And when they had an empty pulpit, they would ask me to come, or somebody gets sick, like Tom Patzer was in 2 churches, and I would come and speak in one. And went into East Texas a lot. And I've had people come up to me on the next visit and say, I went and got one of those. I didn't know that book existed, but I found, and they would now have Haskell's Bible Handbook. Of course, Mark Finley has written one, Studying Together, which is similar to this, but it breaks it down into the belief systems of people that you're going to meet, so that you can identify with them and go forward. But he wrote this at the age of 90, and his regret was that he didn't live long enough, or that he was not going to live long enough to do more. He lived to be 90. He passed away at 91. But look at all the things that he accomplished in those 90 years, simply because he was able. As a matter of fact, he was visiting somebody one time. There was a sheet metal man in some little town where he was visiting, who gave him a tract, Preble's tract on the Sabbath. And he said, you won't catch me keeping that old Jewish Sabbath. He said, I don't want to have anything to do with that. He said, Sunday's our day, and he was satisfied with that. Well, on the way back home, his paddle boat broke down. There's a big steam paddle boat, just 5 miles from home. So they had to pull over to fix the wheel or something. But it gave Haskell an opportunity to go off into the woods and read that tract. He had nothing else to do. And when he came out, he was convinced that, yes, Saturday is the Sabbath. So now he's preaching on 2 days, Saturday and Sunday. And the singing blacksmith told Joseph Bates one time, when their paths crossed, the next time you see Stephen Haskell, you need to talk to him, because he's preaching on both days, and he's got to get a few things straight. So Joseph Bates goes and introduces himself to Haskell, and they studied together, and that's when Haskell began to connect all the dots. J.N. Andrews. This was right after the Great Disappointment, and a lot of people that had sold everything now found themselves destitute. And the Andrews family was very hospitable, and they had taken in a family called the Stowells. I'm sure that your ancestors. But a little girl by the name of Miriam, she was 15 years old. She had a copy of this Preble's flyer on the Sabbath. And she had shared it with her brother. And while they were there, they decided to share it with John Andrews. He was 17. Now here's a little girl, 15 years old, sharing something. I mean, I guess they didn't have the Game Boys and the TVs and the things that we have now to distract us, but that was of concern to her. Now, John Andrews was a very studious, serious-minded person. And he was going to be an attorney, and he was going to get into politics. And he was able to do that. But whenever he read this tract, he became so convinced that this was truth that he abandoned his plans, and he now was concentrating on the Lord's Word. He was an earnest scholar. He mastered Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and French. and he memorized the New Testament. I don't mean a few verses out of it. He memorized the New Testament. And when asked one time, he said, well, there's one book that I have a little bit of trouble with, a few verses right in there. He said, but pretty much I can do it. Now, a number of years ago, I went to see a young man graduate from a boot camp. He was in boot camp for one reason. He either had a choice to go to jail, go to the Army, or go to boot camp. Well, he chose boot camp. And he was there for a year. And when he got ready to graduate, he called me and asked if I would like to come see him graduate. And he had memorized a book out of, I think it was John. And I was just completely blown away that this kid, who was this far from going to prison, had memorized an entire book of the Bible. I'm sorry, chapter out of a book. But here's John Haskell, who has memorized. So it's no wonder that Ellen White, when the Adventists in Europe began to make appeals to the organization in the United States to send us an able man, send us somebody that is good. And he was qualified to do that because he was the third president of the General Conference. And during that time he was in office, they held the first official church camp meeting where the church sponsored it. So they held the camp meeting, and he would go every night, and he would look in on the people that were there and make sure they had everything. He would go tent to tent to tent to tent and visit with them and say, is there anything I can do for you? It was that level of conscientious endeavor that made him so successful. He was also the man who represented our church in front of the legislature in Washington, D.C. to get us the conscientious objector status. We were being pressured because of our refusing to want to bear arms. So we had to defend ourselves in that regard. And with the endorsement of the governor of the state where he lived, he was able to go to Washington and put our case before Congress, and we were given the conscientious objector status. He wrote and he spoke, and he would speak like 12 or 15 times a week. He would be so hoarse that he couldn't hardly talk. But yet he kept on, and he kept on. Now, he started this when he was 21 years of age. And whenever, in 1874, he was asked to go to Europe. And Ellen White said, we're sending you our ablest man. This is the man that we think you are. Because, first of all, James White was recovering from poor health. He had just been elected General Conference president. John Longborough was working in California. So after kind of going through, the only person that was capable of doing that was John Andrews. So he and his son and daughter went to Europe. Tuberculosis was rampant. And unfortunately, his daughter was infected. She came down with tuberculosis. And it was so contagious that they told Andrews, you better not visit her as much as you have been, because you'll get it too. But it was his daughter. And he loved his daughter. He was with her every day. And until she died. And yes, he did contract it. And he died when he was only 54 years old. It's a young man. When you compare to some of the other founding fathers, he died a young man. Well, my first question whenever I was going through this was that why would a man who had that much ability not pace himself? He was burning the candle at both ends and maybe in the middle. He was doing everything that he possibly could. Why would he do that? Why couldn't he have lived? Why didn't he take care of himself? Why? And then I began to realize it was not my place to question why he did what he did. He accepted the commission from the Lord. Paul says to work out your own salvation. And he was committed. Pastor Dennis said just 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was all about Jesus. Okay. Andrews demonstrated that in his work ethic. It was all about Jesus, and he has secured his place in the kingdom simply because of his dedication. So, we enable one another. We are all able to do something. And it doesn't have to be a lot. It doesn't have to be going to start a mission field somewhere. It doesn't have to be going to the far-flung continents. Our mission field, really, as the sign says, starts just when we get out here on Conveyor Drive. That's the mission field. Mark Antony was here a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks ago. He said that the churches in America are losing 97 to 98% of their youth within 2 years of them leaving home. I could not believe that. Not that I was doubting him, but I see the young people in our congregation. I see them doing things and standing up and taking part, and I just didn't realize that it was that rampant. Either this is a very fortunate church, or we're going to be disappointed in some of the kids in our pews today. I can't see that happening. I think our children, we've always said our young people are going to be finishing the work. Some of the young people started the work. Back whenever the Great Awakening was happening all over the world, in Europe, where there were severe hardships and penalties for speaking out, the Lord was impressing kids 5 and 6 years old to get up in church and speak. And they were talking about the soon coming of Jesus. But it's a shame that our young people are drifting away, but there's too many distractions, there's too many things to catch their eye. It is an uphill struggle. But what we can do is to enable our church brethren. What we can do is enable one another. What we can do is live the way we've been taught. What we can do is live the way we're instructed. And we thereby enable one another. We enable ourselves because the person we are enabling, it's a two-way street. It's kind of like trying to give somebody a hug. You don't ever give a hug away because they're hugging you back. They're giving it right back to you. And that's the way it is with enabling. That's the way it is. We edify one another. We build one another up. We support one another. We take care of one another. And it's all going to come back to a tightening, because just before the second coming, we're going to need one another. You can't go to somebody that you snubbed a few years ago. I mean, you can, but I don't know what kind of result you're going to get. Don't wait till we get to heaven before you decide you're going to live next door to somebody. I won't live next door to him down here, but when I get to heaven, it'll all be different. That's not going to happen. Yes, John Andrews was the ablest man to go and do and accept the commission or the charge that he was given by the General Conference. And he must have done a good job of it, because look at where we are today as a result of those kind of commitments. And I think all that we need to do is, when we have our private devotional, is just to ask the Lord to strengthen us so that we be consistent. I know that's a struggle for me, being consistent. And I won't go there, but I know that's my problem. But our eyes should be on the prize. Our eyes should be on Jesus. And if your life is consumed as a result of your eye being on Jesus, that's not a bad thing. But we have too many things to draw us away, to make our eye wander. 54 years, and he passed away. But he accomplished a great, great deal because he was able. Thank you.